It's 1990, and somewhere in Central Florida, a green geyser is about to erupt on live television for the very first time. Inside the building behind it, kids are being slimed, gacked, and interviewed by a man in suspenders, and the whole thing is being broadcast to millions of households as the birth of something new. That building would go on to produce over 2,000 episodes of television, employ hundreds of people, and become one of the most recognizable places in children's entertainment. And then, quietly, it would disappear. So today we're looking at how Nickelodeon Studios Florida went from TV empire to forgotten attraction. The deal nobody expected. Back in the late 1980s, Universal was trying to build a theme park in Orlando that could actually compete with Disney. And executives had figured out something fairly obvious once you say it out loud. People like watching real television get made. Disney had its own working studio tour already lined up. Universal did not. So in November of 1988, Universal made contact with Nickelodeon, a cable channel that, at the time, was still very much the underdog of children's television. Nowhere near the ratings juggernaut it would become a few years later. The pitch worked both ways. Universal got a built-in content partner that would keep kids and families walking through the park, and Nickelodeon got a shiny new home base with essentially no financial risk attached. The deal Universal offered was, frankly, a steal for Nickelodeon. The network didn't have to pay rent to operate out of the space, which is the kind of arrangement most businesses only dream about. Universal wanted the credibility of a functioning production studio inside its theme park badly enough to give it away almost for free. By spring of 1989, before the park had even opened to the public, Nickelodeon was already filming there. The very first show taped inside those sound stages was Super Sloppy Double Dare, which is a fittingly chaotic way to christen a building that would spend the next decade and a half covered in slime. It's worth pointing out that Universal's whole park concept, the one Nickelodeon Studios would eventually anchor, had actually been kicking around since the early 1970s. MCA, the parent company behind Universal, had floated the idea of building a Florida version of its Hollywood studio tour decades earlier, but the plan collapsed during an economic downturn and got shelved for years. By the time the company revived it in the late 80s, the entertainment landscape had changed enough that a straightforward studio tour on its own wasn't going to be a strong enough draw against Disney's growing footprint in the same city. Pairing that tour with an active, kid-focused network gave Universal something Disney simply didn't have, and it gave Nickelodeon a physical home at a moment when the network badly needed one to compete for attention against far larger, far better funded children's programming blocks, building the first world headquarters for kids. Universal Studios. Florida opened on June 7, 1990, and Nickelodeon Studios opened alongside it that same day, branded with the rather grand title, The First World Headquarters for Kids. It's a name that sounds like it was written by a marketing department that had never met an exclamation point it didn't like. And honestly, that tracks for Nickelodeon in this era. The opening was not a quiet ribbon cutting. It was a 3-hour live special broadcast on Nickelodeon itself, hosted by Mark Summers, the Double Dare host who had basically become the face of the network. He wasn't alone. Other Nickelodeon personalities showed up too, including Harvey from Double Dare, Greg Lee, and the cast of Hey Dude, among them Christine Taylor and Kelly Brown. Les Lie, known for his work on the Canadian import You Can't Do That on Television, was there as well, along with Skip Lackey, who had hosted Total Panic for the network. There were musical performances from acts like Kid and Play, The Cover Girls, and Perfect Gentleman, because apparently a children's television studio opening in 1990 needed a full concert lineup to properly christen it. The special itself cut between two main sets, a Florida postcard-themed backdrop and the outdoor party stage where the musical acts performed, along with a walkthrough of the new sound stages and a peek at the wider Universal Studios Florida park beyond them. There was also a short physical challenge lifted straight from Double Dare, just to make sure nobody watching at home forgot what network they were tuned into. And in one of the more charmingly excessive touches of the whole promotional buildup, Nickelodeon had earlier put a single contest winner on an actual Amtrak train, nicknamed the Nick Express, decked out with Nintendo Entertainment Systems for the ride down, all the way from up north to Florida for the big day. It's the kind of stunt that only really made sense in an era before overnight shipping and video calls made cross-country travel feel unremarkable. The whole 3-hour broadcast built toward a single moment, the countdown to the studio's very first slime eruption, timed to coincide with the official opening of both the studio and the park around it. Everything else that day, the performances, the interviews, the walkthroughs, was essentially there to kill time until that countdown hit zero. And then there was Steven Spielberg. He was serving as the creative consultant for the entire Universal Studios Florida park. And Mark Summers, never one to miss an opportunity, got him to show up in a hard hat and poncho and asked him a simple question live on air. The answer, predictably, ended with the director of Jaws and E.T. getting slimed in front of a national television audience. If you're going to open a children's studio, you might as well baptize a legendary filmmaker in green goo while you're at it. The slime geyser arrives. The famous slime geyser, the thing most people actually remember when they picture this place, wasn't even there on opening day. It came 4 months later, officially unveiled on October the 27th, 1990. Once it existed, though, it became the unofficial mascot of the entire studio. Every 15 minutes or so, a horn would sound. The accordion tubes on the geyser would start swaying, pressure would build, and then the whole contraption would launch bright green slime into the air, splattering down into a pool below with just enough force to soak anyone standing too close. It became such a visual shorthand for the brand that a print ad from the period summed the whole operation up pretty efficiently, describing it as the one place to get slimed, gacked, and double-dared. That's not a bad tagline for a building that essentially ran on the premise of humiliating children on camera in the most good-natured way possible. For a lot of families who visited Universal Studios Florida in the early 90s, the geyser wasn't just a backdrop for the tour, it was practically a landmark in its own right. Something people planned their walk through Production Central around so they'd be standing there when it erupted. Home video footage from the period shows an almost disproportionate amount of tape dedicated to that one prop compared to the rest of the park's marquee rides, which says something about how effectively a fairly simple mechanical trick, essentially a glorified fountain filled with green goo, managed to capture people's attention in a park otherwise built around Hollywood-style thrill rides and movie tie-ins. What guests actually walked through. The tour itself lasted around 40 to 45 minutes in its original form, and it wasn't just a walk past some cameras. Guests entered through Production Central, past rows of numbered sound stages that looked exactly like what you'd expect from a real working studio lot, because that's what it was. There was no facade here. These were functioning sound stages where actual Nickelodeon shows were being filmed, sometimes while the tour group walked by. The route took visitors up an escalator toward viewing areas where they could look in on productions in progress, then through the wardrobe and makeup departments, and eventually into the GAC kitchen, where the network's signature green slime and its cousin, the stretchy toy substance called GAC, were actually mixed and prepared. Guests got to touch it, sometimes taste it, which in hindsight is a slightly alarming detail for a children's attraction. But this was the early 90s, and nobody seemed particularly bothered. The tour concluded in what became known as the Game Lab, a live show within a show where selected members of the audience got to test out game concepts that were being prototyped for future Nickelodeon programming. If you were lucky, or unlucky depending on how you looked at it, you ended up at the wrong end of a slime bucket in front of a room full of strangers. This wasn't a simulation of a Nickelodeon show. It genuinely was one, run for and by the people standing in line that day. That last point is honestly the thing that separated this attraction from basically everything else Universal or Disney had, running at the same time. A ride is designed to feel the same on your 100th visit as it did on your first, because it's a fixed physical loop, repeating the same motions regardless of who's sitting in the car. The Game Lab wasn't fixed in that way. The games being tested changed, depending on what Nickelodeon's producers were actually developing that month, which meant two families walking through on different weeks could genuinely have completely different experiences waiting for them at the end of the same 45-minute tour. And beyond the scheduled tour route, guests who signed up in advance or occasionally got pulled aside while waiting in line had the chance to sit in the audience for actual tapings of shows like Figure It Out, Legends of the Hidden Temple, or later, Slime Time Live, meaning the building's daily schedule genuinely dictated what any given visitor might stumble into. The shows that made it famous. Over its run, Nickelodeon Studios produced more than 2,000 episodes of original programming, and the list of shows that came out of those sound stages reads like a syllabus for anyone who grew up on the network in the 90s. Family Double Dare, and later Double Dare 2000 were filmed there. So was Clarissa Explains It All, Figure It Out, Legends of the Hidden Temple, Nickelodeon Arcade, Slime Time Live, and even early seasons of All That and Kenan and Kel. Game shows in particular thrived in this format because they required exactly what the studio offered: a live audience pulled straight from the theme park crowds outside. Kids visiting Universal Studios Florida with their families could, on any given day, end up as actual contestants on national television without planning for it at all. That's a strange kind of magic that simply doesn't exist in the streaming era, where a show gets filmed in a sealed-off lot with a hired studio audience that signed up months in advance. By 1994, the studio had become the largest production facility in the state of Florida, employing around 400 people at its peak and generating an estimated $110 million in business for the state. This wasn't a novelty attraction propped up for tourists. It was a legitimate, functioning piece of the state's television industry, one that happened to also sell theme park tickets. Beyond the marquee game shows, the studio also handled a surprising range of sitcoms and specials over the years, including My Brother and Me, Welcome Freshmen, The Mystery Files of Shelby Woo, and Weinerville, along with the sketch-adjacent Nickelodeon Launchbox. Even into the studio's later, quieter years, there was still enough happening on those sound stages to keep the lights on, with productions like Noah Knows Best and Tina both filming there around the turn of the millennium, alongside Double Dare 2000, a short-lived attempt to revive the format that had started the whole operation a decade earlier. It's a fairly wide range of programming for a single physical location, spanning slapstick game shows, teen sitcoms, and educational specials like Teacher to Teacher with Mr. Wizard, all coming out of the same handful of sound stages in the same Orlando office park. The community side of things. Nickelodeon Studios wasn't purely a production facility either. It doubled as something of a headquarters for the network's youth outreach efforts. The Kids World Council, a group made up of young people who weighed in on network initiatives, was based there, as was much of the coordination behind The Big Help, Nickelodeon's community service campaign that pushed kids across the country to volunteer. In April of 1992, the studio buried a time capsule outside Soundstage 18, timed to be opened 50 years later. The ceremony was broadcast live, hosted by Mike O'Malley and Joey Lawrence, and the capsule's contents were voted on by the Kids World Council itself, giving actual kids a say in what future generations would find. It's a small detail, but it says something about how seriously the network treated its young audience during this period, at least in terms of giving them a visible stake in the brand. The items sealed inside reportedly ranged from pop culture artifacts of the moment, including a copy of Back to the Future on VHS and a Barbie doll, to items meant to represent the broader concerns of kids at the time. It's a strange little snapshot of what a group of children in 1992 decided was worth preserving for their counterparts 50 years down the line. And it's arguably one of the more sincere gestures to come out of a studio otherwise built around slime buckets and physical comedy. Whether anyone involved in that ceremony expected the building itself to be gone long before that 50-year mark arrived is another question entirely. The slow fade. Nothing lasts forever, and by the late 90s, the cracks were starting to show, even if most guests walking through the tour had no idea. Nickelodeon's production priorities were shifting steadily westward, toured a facility called Nickelodeon on Sunset in Los Angeles. The network's biggest hits were increasingly animated shows like SpongeBob SquarePants and Rugrats, which didn't require a live studio audience or a slime geyser at all. You can't put a cartoon in front of a crowd of theme park guests and call it interactive television. Game shows, which had been the studio's entire reason for existing, were also falling out of favor across the network's programming lineup. By 2001, the writing was on the wall enough that the studio began laying off employees, since most of Nickelodeon's closed-set productions had already relocated to California. That same year, the studio auctioned off its remaining props from an off-site storage facility, which is a fairly blunt way of signaling that the operation was winding down for good. The tour itself got noticeably shorter and thinner during this stretch. What had once been a 45-minute walk through an actual functioning studio eventually got trimmed down to around 15 minutes, largely bypassing the soundstage areas entirely and heading straight for the GAC kitchen and game lab, since there simply wasn't much active production left to show visitors. It's one thing to watch a studio decline in the ratings. It's another to watch the physical tour route get shortened, because there's nothing left behind the curtain to justify the walk. By 2002, staffing had dropped to a fraction of what it had been at the studio's peak. Then, in August of 2004, Hurricane Charlie tore through Central Florida and damaged the facility further, accelerating a decline that was already well underway. None of this happened because Nickelodeon suddenly fell out of favor with kids. If anything, the network was arguably more dominant in the broader children's television landscape by the early 2000s than it had ever been in 1990. The issue wasn't popularity, it was format. A network built increasingly around evergreen animated hits simply didn't need a live studio audience the way a network built around game shows and sketch comedy did. You don't fly families in to watch someone record dialogue for a cartoon. The entire business case for keeping 400 people employed at a live audience facility in Florida quietly evaporated once the shows that justified it stopped being the network's priority. The last show. The final program ever taped at Nickelodeon Studios was a game show called Nickelodeon Splat, which aired live on August 17, 2004. There wasn't a big send-off attached to it at the time. No farewell tour announcement, no retrospective special. It was simply the last time cameras rolled inside a building that had spent 14 years producing some of the most recognizable children's television in the country. For a while after that, the tour limped along without any actual production happening behind the scenes, essentially reduced to walking guests through the game lab and prop rooms. That arrangement lasted until April 30th, 2005, when Nickelodeon Studios gave its final tour and closed permanently. In an oddly poetic detail, that closing date fell exactly 13 years after the time capsule had been buried outside the building. Whether that timing was intentional or just a coincidence nobody bothered to plan around, it's hard to say. Either way, after 14 years, 10 months, and 30 days in operation, the doors shut for good. One fan who visited in the weeks after the closure, posting on a theme park forum at the time, described walking past the building and noticing the green slime machine, and most of the other props had simply vanished, with staff already stripping the area of its old signage. Universal wasn't sentimental about the teardown. Within about a year, the Nickelodeon branding on the exterior had been removed entirely. There was some grumbling at the time, as there always is when a beloved attraction closes. Petitions circulated among fans hoping to convince Universal or Nickelodeon to reverse the decision, and message boards briefly filled with rumors about where the operation might be heading instead, with one particularly persistent theory suggesting Viacom might shift Nickelodeon's theme park presence over to Paramount's chain of parks entirely. None of that speculation panned out. The closure wasn't a prelude to a relocation. It was simply the end of the arrangement, full stop, and the building sat there for roughly 2 years afterward with no clear plan for what would come next. What replaced it? Universal didn't let the space sit empty for long. In June of 2007, the building reopened as the Sharp Aquos Theater, home to a residency from the Blue Man Group, trading the studio's bright orange and green color scheme for a much more subdued blue exterior. It's hard to imagine a more fitting visual metaphor for the shift in tone, from the loud, chaotic energy of a kid's game show factory to the deliberately quiet, performance art strangeness of three bald men in blue face paint banging on PVC pipes. The Blue Man Group ran there for well over a decade, until their residency ended on February 1st, 2021, a casualty of the broader disruption theme parks and live entertainment venues faced around that period. Since then, the space has largely sat vacant, occasionally used for seasonal events like the Grinch Mass Holiday Show during the Christmas season, but without any permanent tenant. Interestingly, Nickelodeon itself didn't vanish from Universal Orlando entirely once the studio closed. A ride based on The Adventures of Jimmy Neutron continued operating in the park until 2011, years after the studio itself had shut down, giving guests one last direct connection to the brand even after the cameras had stopped rolling. The network even briefly returned to film a short-lived competition series called My Family's Got Guts in 2008, though that turned out to be its final production at the Orlando park. In the years between the studio's closure and the Blue Man Group's arrival, the old Q line found an unexpected second life too, briefly used to funnel audiences into tapings of TNA Impact, a professional wrestling program, before the Sharp Aquos Theater officially took over the space. It's a strange bit of trivia on its own. A building built to launch children's game shows spending part of its idle years shuffling wrestling fans through the same hallways where kids once lined up to get slimed. But it fits the broader pattern of a space that Universal never quite let sit empty for long, even during the gap years when nobody had settled on what it should permanently become. What's left behind? Walk through that section of Universal Studios Florida today, and you'd be forgiven for having no idea what used to be there. But a few small traces survive if you know where to look. Wall murals from the Nickelodeon era, including one depicting a family Double Dare taping, are reportedly still intact in backstage areas not open to the general public. There's a mural referencing Blue's Clues, tucked near a second-floor tube, and another nodding to SpongeBob SquarePants along an upstairs hallway, quiet leftovers from a building that spent a decade and a half covered in the network's imagery. Perhaps the strangest surviving detail is a set of bathrooms tucked under a staircase, still tiled in the same green color scheme the studio used throughout its run, essentially untouched since the Nickelodeon days despite everything else around them being renovated or repurposed. It's a strange kind of time capsule in its own right, more literal than the one Nickelodeon actually buried, which was dug up in August of 2007, and rather than opened as planned decades later, was simply paved over. There's something almost fitting about that particular detail. A network that spent its entire identity on this property, insisting kids' opinions mattered, right down to letting them vote on what went into a literal time capsule, ended up having that same capsule quietly excavated and disposed of years ahead of schedule, with no ceremony and no live broadcast this time around. Compare that to the 3-hour spectacle that marked the building's opening, and the gap in treatment says a lot about how differently a company handles the birth of a project versus its eventual, unglamorous wind-down. Nobody schedules a primetime special for taking something apart. Why this story sticks with people? It's tempting to treat this as a simple story about a theme park attraction closing down, the kind of thing that happens to dozens of rides and shows every year without anyone outside a small circle of enthusiasts noticing. But Nickelodeon Studios occupied a strange middle ground that doesn't really exist anymore. It wasn't purely a ride, and it wasn't purely a television studio either. It was both, operating simultaneously, in front of a live audience that had, in many cases, wandered in from a theme park without any advance planning. That format required a specific set of circumstances to work: a network built around live-action programming, a genre of television, the game show that thrives on audience participation, and a business model where a theme park was willing to hand over soundstage space essentially for free in exchange for the prestige of having real production happening inside its gates. Once Nickelodeon's programming shifted toward animation, and its live-action ambitions moved to a proper studio lot in Los Angeles, none of those conditions applied anymore. The building didn't fail because of some dramatic single event. It simply outlived the specific era of television that had justified its existence in the first place. For the people who visited as kids in the early 90s, though, none of that context really matters. What matters is that a random trip to a theme park in Florida sometimes turned into standing in a real television studio, watching real slime hit a real contestant, with the very real chance that you might be the one getting covered in it next. That kind of unscripted possibility is difficult to manufacture today, and it's probably part of why so many people who grew up watching Nickelodeon still bring this place up with a strange kind of reverence, even though most of them never actually got the chance to visit before it closed. It also helps that so little of it exists in a form people can revisit. There's no streaming archive of full Nickelodeon Studios tapings sitting around waiting to be rewatched the way there is for the shows themselves. Most of what survives is scattered home video footage, a handful of documentary interviews, and the increasingly patchy memories of people who were there once, maybe twice, decades ago. That scarcity tends to sharpen nostalgia rather than dull it. A show you can rewatch on demand loses some of its mystique simply by being available, a place you can never physically return to because it hasn't existed in its original form since George W. Bush's first term, only grows fuzzier and more mythologized with each passing year, which might explain why a fairly modest television production facility in Central Florida still gets brought up in the same breath as far more elaborate, far more expensive attractions that Universal built and demolished in the decades since. Nickelodeon Studios didn't get a dramatic farewell. There was no emotional finale special, no on-air tribute marking its closure the way the network had celebrated its opening back in 1990. It just quietly stopped operating one spring afternoon in 2005. Its slime geyser eventually dismantled, its sound stages repainted, its name slowly scraped off a building most people now associate with 3 blue-painted performers instead, and that, more than anything else, is probably the most fitting way this particular story could have ended. For a network that spent 14 years teaching an entire generation that getting messy in public wasn't something to be embarrassed about. If you like taking this walk back through Nickelodeon Studios Florida, hit like and subscribe for more videos digging into the theme parks, attractions, and pieces of television history that quietly disappeared without the send-off they probably deserved.